So welcome to today's briefing, the first of 2023, on the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI, who died on New Year's Eve last week. And to assess his life and contribution, we're joined by Catherine Pepinster, journalist and author of The Keys and the Kingdom, The British and the Papacy from John Paul II to Francis; Michael Walsh, a Catholic historian and author of A Dictionary of Popes; and the Jesuits from Ignatius of Loyola to Pope Francis. Professor Tina Beattie, director of the Catherine of Siena College at the University of Roehampton, whose books include New Catholic Feminism, Theology and Theory. And we hope a bit later in the day, Christopher Lamb, Rome correspondent for The Tablet and author of The Outsider on Pope Francis. So thank you all for joining us on this first day of term, as it were. So many plaudits, tributes already to Pope Benedict XVI, who's known as a great theologian and an academic, an ultra-conservative with his views while prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and as Pope, one controversy after another, but perhaps most remembered for his decision to resign, the first Pope to do so for 600 years. So in this discussion, we're going to signpost those moments and ask you as a panel to talk about this one with another. But first of all, to introduce you to everyone on the call and to one another, can I just ask you for a headline, really, as to how you remember Pope Benedict XVI? Catherine, perhaps I could start with you. What's your headline response? How would you remember Benedict?
I think I remember him inevitably mostly for the fact that he resigned so dramatically. I also remember him because of his state visit to the UK. And there was a lot of trepidation about him coming to the UK, partly because the church's response to him, the people in the pew, their response to him was so divided. And so would people turn out, even Catholics, for him? And there was a lot of expectation there'd be huge amounts of protests and he wouldn't go down well at all. And the visit was very successful. People liked him. He had a reputation for being a hardliner theologian, certainly before he became Pope. But the man who came to Britain was a rather shy, studious, quite charming man who spoke very well, particularly at Westminster Hall, where he discussed religion's role in the public square. So there were these contrasts with Benedict. But if you look back at his papacy now, what you see is this quiet, intellectual, teaching Pope who produced really finely written encyclicals, but it caused the most enormous controversy and many, many problems, yet was adored by a particular type of Catholic.
Thank you, Catherine. And asking the same question to you, Michael, how do you remember, or how is Pope Benedict XVI remembered?
Well, I think like Catherine, I remember him coming to Britain. That was quite an event. The BBC sent me up to meet him, as it were, at Edinburgh. Not personally, I understand, so I could there talk about it. And the thing I remembered about that event was he was delivered to the cargo terminal at Edinburgh Airport. I can't disagree with Catherine at all. I mean, he was a very controversial character before he was elected. The fact that he was a nice man was well known. I mean, he was fond of cats. He played the piano. You could stop him crossing the piazza in St. Peter's and talk to him. He was not a remote figure at all, though everybody says he was shy. I mean, I'm not speaking from personal experience, you understand. But I think that his contribution to the papacy, apart from the fact of his resigning it, which is a very important contribution to the papacy, was disastrous in many ways. I mean, it has left the church divided, particularly not so much in this country, I think, as in the United States. So my memory of him really is of a man who was a controversial character, as I say, but a very divisive character.
Thank you. Tina Beattie, Professor Tina Beattie, the same question to you. How do you think Pope Benedict will be remembered?
I'd repeat everything that's already been said, but I also do think that this was a very difficult papacy. I think he was a hugely complex man and full of deeply worrying contradictions for those of us trying to navigate our way through making a contribution to the Church's theology, because on the one hand, he was highly regarded as a theologian and a scholar. I think he was a much better scholar than he was church administrator. But on the other hand, he had an absolutely crushing impact on the intellectual life of the church with the authoritarian regime he ran, first as head of the CDF and then as Pope. He made it very difficult to have any creative, interesting, dynamic theological debate within the church, particularly around the issues that were most neuralgic for him. I'd say the control of women, the exclusion of women from ordination, and all issues to do with human sexuality, LGBT issues, etc. So popes come and go. I don't think his impact on the Catholic Church is going to be huge, but his resignation may well be.
Thank you. So I think the best way to go through his life and unpack some of those observations that you've made is to signpost this, if you like, chronologically. And those of you on the call, if you have any questions at any moment, do come in. But we'll listen to the panel discuss Pope Benedict. So can we start first of all with what we know about the man, his early life, what shaped and created him? And perhaps Catherine, I could start with you. You kicked off this whole discussion with a great explainer on our website for us, where you talked about his early life and his family and his brother and his sister. Tell us what we know about Benedict, his early life and the man.
One of the things I remember reading about him some time ago, of his own writings, was an account that he wrote of growing up in Bavaria and southern Germany in an incredibly devout Catholic world. And he had the most immense nostalgia for it. And I think that nostalgia really coloured his thinking about the church going forward in his life. You know, that for him, the Bavarian childhood, not just the Catholic Church, how it was then, but the close family, the beauty of Bavaria, the flowers even, all that meant a huge amount to him. And perhaps that encouraged his real passion for aesthetics, for example. But of course, that idyllic world was so rudely interrupted by Nazism and by the Second World War. He was born in 1927, so he was, a child, a teenager at the time of Nazism. His father, a policeman, was opposed to Nazism, and that affected his career, and the family moved around quite a bit. Benedict himself was conscripted, forced as youths were, to join the Hitler Youth. Then he went into the army. He eventually deserted from it. There've been a lot of people who've said that he was the Nazi Pope. That's a reading of him that's very crude, because of the time he grew up in. But there's not a great deal of evidence at all to suggest that he was in any way affiliated to Nazism himself. And then after the end of the war, he was studying. Both he and his brother had vocations to the priesthood, and they both became priests. They studied at the same time, and they both were ordained in 1951. And I think something that's really significant about him is that he wasn't a man with pastoral background. He didn't go down the route that most Catholic priests do of being a parish priest. He quickly went into academia, and later on, talking to his biographer Peter Savold, he said that even being appointed Archbishop of Munich, which happened in 1971, for him it was the end of the life that he had wanted, which was the life of academia.
It
So
was a very close family. I got from what you wrote, that his
yes,
brother George, he was ordained with him, and his sister apparently was with him for much of his ministry, including in the Vatican.
yes. So she was a housekeeper. So they were a very close trio. Yes. And Benedict, he didn't come across as a kind of a man, kind of wide social circle, a great extrovert, but he also always had these very close relationships. He had certain individuals that he was very connected to, people who would join him for sort of almost like summer schools, academic summer schools during his time when he was in Rome as a Vatican official, and he continued those into the papacy as well.
Thank you. There's not much more to say about his family life. Can I turn to you, Michael, then, for the next signpost, which is his reputation as a great theologian. And he was, was it 26 years, a professor at various universities in Germany. What can you tell us about his life as an academic and his influence and reputation?
Well, as Catherine has said, he was an academic by inclination. He was, in fact, the chosen theologian that Cardinal Flings asked to accompany to the Second Vatican Council. I think one of the things that has to be remembered about him is that at the Second Vatican Council, he was on what some might regard as the side of the angels. He was definitely, he was what you might say was a progressive of the council. He was a big pal of his daytime. I was going to say nemesis, but that's not quite the right word. Hans Küng, the two of them are together, and Küng, of course, famously got him into Tübingen University, and was the most significant theological faculty in Germany at the time, probably still is. And he went to Tübingen. Well, unfortunately, from my point of view, he had a change of heart. He had a change of heart because of I don't think it's a fact. The upset of 1968, the student revolution, and he didn't like students who didn't sit at their desks and listen to him. And he left and went back to stay with his brother, where he told one friend of his that it was so lovely living in his house in Regensburg with all the music. In fact, his brother was the choir master at Regensburg Cathedral. He loved living in this sort of atmosphere. And then, of course, he was called to be Archbishop of Munich, which he had no reason to accept. I mean, he could have objected, but anyway, he accepted, no doubt, out of
This switch that you were describing from being a reformist, or at least somebody who was an advisor to Vatican II, and then switching to a more conservative line. What was the thing that happened that switched him? I read somewhere that there was an incident in one of his lectures where some radical students protested against what he was saying. You're nodding your head. Protested at what he was saying. Was it that he was such a shy man that really freaked him out, basically?
I don't think it was actually the upset in 1968 that changed his theological perspective. I mean, Hans Küng and Rana, sorry, I beg your pardon, not Rana. I'm talking about Rana. And Hans Küng and Ratzinger created a magazine together called Concilium, which was a progressive magazine and the source of many of the most important articles interpreting the Second Vatican Council to the populace. But he got very upset with that, and in fact went off and founded another magazine. Both of them, as far as I know, are still in existence, not being in the theological world anymore. I'm not sure, but I think they still are, called Communio, which was taken over by a very conservative group. I don't think that his upset in 68 actually changed his theological opinions. I think they'd been changing before. He became a bit frightened by the way in which the church was going. He wasn't, of course, the only one. I mean, Pope Paul VI felt the same way.
I think we can join all these dots, though. My feeling is that he was a fearful man, and the roots for that, I suspect, can be found in the chaos and horror of Nazism. And I think his classroom was stormed during the 1968 student uprisings. But my own reading of it is that he saw a spectre appearing over the horizon that he associated with anarchy and disorder, and it triggered so much of the world he'd grown up in. And there's a kind of continuum to me. So Vatican II unleashed huge theological diversity, creativity, and challenge. Feminism, liberation theology. Suddenly the sort of world of ideas was flooding in on this precious, sacred beauty that he understood the Catholic Church to be. Then there were the student uprisings. There was the disastrous, in my view, promulgation of Humanae Vitae, with the reiteration of the prohibition against artificial birth control, which caused sort of uprisings in the rank and file of ordinary Catholics. And I think we can read his austere attitude towards sexuality in the same light. Everywhere he looked, I think, he saw the threat of chaos. And I don't think that was entirely misguided. You know, he spoke about cultural relativism in a way that was obsessive and often not well informed. But at the same time, when we look at our post-truth society disintegrating into every kind of ignorant populism, there was truth in what he saw, and if only he had been less driven by fear and more driven by the reason that he so celebrated, I think he could have been a very, very important voice. But I just think he went so far with his absolutism and allowed fear rather than reason to drive, in my view, his ways of leading.
Just picking up what Tina was saying yesterday and the move to his reactionary views. He then went from university to become Archbishop of Munich, as you were saying and telling us earlier, Michael. And then he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the Vatican. And there, Christopher Lamb, we've got Christopher on the call now. In your article in the tablet, Christopher, you were speaking about this time in his life and how he earned the nickname God's Rottweiler. Can you tell us why and how he earned the nickname?
Oh, thanks, Ruth. Yes, that period where Cardinal Ratzinger was in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was a time when many theologians, a number of theologians, were investigated, silenced, reprimanded, warned. The likes of Hans Kung, Leonardo Boff, Peter Fan, Jacques Dupuy. And these were theologians who were, I think, to Ratzinger's mind, stepping over the boundaries of what he thought was acceptable in terms of the formulations of Catholic doctrine or the exploration of Catholic doctrine. They were also people who felt that it wasn't just that they were being investigated, it was the way that the investigations happened. They tended to be totally opaque. It wasn't clear what they were being accused of. And in the case of Father Jacques Dupuy, who was a Jesuit who worked in India most of his life and was, I think, a very creative theologian around the whole question of interreligious dialogue, and he was basically being accused of a kind of relativism by the CDF, which, if you read Dupuy, you can see how that's not necessarily the case. But anyway, Jacques Dupuy was investigated, and it took a huge toll on his life, on his health. And there are many people who feel that investigation really hurt him terribly. And I think that was the criticism that came in, was that the number of investigations and the way they were carried out. Now, I think one of the reasons they were carried out in this opaque way was because Cardinal Ratzinger inherited a system from years gone by, and one of his things he struggled with was the whole question of governance and challenging structures and also appointing the right people. So he had a very clear vision, beautifully articulated in his theological books. He was a very good teacher. I agree with what Tina was saying about being prophetic in terms of the dictatorship of relativism and post-truth society. But in terms of structural change, institutional change and reform in the church, and appointing the right people to key positions, that was never his strong point. And I think that was part of the problem when he was at the CDF.
I think one thing we that perhaps because he became Pope, we focus so much on him being Pope, but you might argue that given he spent 27 years as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and given the climate that was created when he was at the CDF, a climate of fear, a climate of limitation on more adventurous thinking, that his impact on the Catholic Church was greater at that time than it was during his papacy, apart from his resignation. I'd be interested in what the others think about that, but he was a really feared individual, and I remember I didn't meet Jacques Dupree myself, but I knew his friends, and they would talk about just how traumatized he was by what happened to him.
I think I would agree with that. I mean, I remember thinking that it was a bit. I mean, this is a bit maybe a bit recherche, but we had what was the equivalent of a modernist crisis. And the modernist crisis happened in the Catholic Church at the beginning of the 20th century, and in a sense, it was suppressed by Pius X. And we were back in the same situation under JP2, I think, with Ratzinger at the helm, the CDF. When he was during the conclave, I was asked by somebody, what did I think a new pope would call himself? I said Benedict. I said Benedict because I remember Benedict XV had put an end to the modernist crisis, and I hope the new pope will put an end to the modernist crisis. Well, he did choose the name Benedict, but not for that reason.
I think it's right that his appointments of people to key positions were disastrous. And I think we have to see Pope John Paul II and Ratzinger / Benedict XVI as a continuous double act, really, because in a way, the church that Benedict XVI inherited was a church that he had created as head of the CDF. And I would agree that what I would call the most ferocious impact of his authoritarianism came during his years in the CDF. But that was continued by Cardinal Müller, and it's interesting how many of the people who were assigned to key posts, including many of the US bishops during the Ratzinger, John Paul II, Benedict leadership, are now harsh enemies of Pope Francis. Of course, Pope Benedict claimed and was very loyal in his support for Francis, but he didn't absent himself from the Vatican, and he didn't quite keep as quiet as he'd said he would in recent years. So, there was an ongoing friction and division, which can be healthy. I mean, I think people who look at the Catholic Church from the outside and think we all do whatever the Pope tells us and, it's all one thing. It's absolutely not and never has been. But I think the frictions he allowed to fester, including the abuse crisis, of course, as head of the CDF and then Pope, were very destructive. And I know he did, as Pope, he did more than his predecessor to begin to tackle the abuse crisis, but actually even Francis hasn't begun to tackle it in the ways we all want to see it tackled.
Given that reputation of a ferocious Rottweiler, Tina, how do you explain the fact that he went on to be elected as Pope?
Well, it's interesting. God works in mysterious ways. I don't know enough. Catherine would know a lot more, and Michael a lot more than I do about the politics of papal elections. But, given that the people appointed as cardinals, as leaders of the church during his time, were the ones who were electing the new pope, it was a surprise to many of us. But there you are. I think the same thing could happen again when Pope Francis is replaced. There are these deep factions that that Ratzinger helped to create. And they're still there, and they're more divisive now than they have been at any time.
There are not so many of them, in the sense that one of the things about the conclave that elected JP2 that elected Benedict, all the cardinals, all except a handful, had been appointed under John Paul II. That is not going to be the case in the next conclave, I should imagine, because the present Pope has said he's going to retire anyway, he's indicated that, and he's quite a good age as it is. So the conclave will be more open, I think. So he has, everybody's pleased to see, which I think is very undemocratic, that he's packed the conclave, with the future conclave, with people that are like-minded. I don't think people should be allowed to do that. I think the election of the Pope should be taken out of the hands of cardinals, but that's another topic.
I think the thing that isn't always realised when it comes to the choosing of a new Pope is that the conclave is only part of it. Two other things go on in Rome when there's an interregnum and you have what they call the sede vacante, the vacant throne of Peter. There are official gatherings of cardinals in advance of the conclave where they are addressed by different individuals about the issues of the day that they need to think about when they're voting. And there are also other gatherings too, informal gatherings of cardinals. Now, the College of Cardinals is made up of two lots of people. There's the voting cardinals, those under 80, and the cardinals over 80 who can't vote in the conclave. But they're all there in Rome for this election. And when it comes to the more informal gatherings in advance of the conclave, there's quite a lot of lobbying that goes on with different parties effectively pushing their man, and it's always a man. And when it came to the election of Benedict XVI, the more traditional Catholics were very well organised about that. And the more progressive liberal Catholic cardinals realised that 8 years later when it came to the election of Francis, and there was a lot more of these informal lobbying events from both sides. So we have to remember that there's politics in here, not just the Holy Spirit deciding who might become the next Pope.
Cardinal Ratzinger was such a public figure in the church, and he had 20 plus years, 23 years, I think, at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. And in that time, he met all the cardinals and all the electors and all the bishops, and he played a key role in appointments. And whilst we've talked about the reputation that Ratzinger had as the God's Rottweiler, that was not true for those who met him, and that's not what his character was like. 1-to-1, he was known as a gentlemanly, gentle, kind person. Didn't like confrontation. Now, there was obviously some tension there in his character, but certainly those who met him and worked with him positively had a good approach. And of course, there was the death of John Paul II that changed things, whereas the resignation of Benedict allowed for a different kind of discussion to take place over who should be the next Pope. There wasn't the spectre of the dead Pope hanging over.
Ratzinger, before he became Pope, in that interregnum after the death of John Paul II, he wasn't just one of the most familiar figures in the church already. He became even more present to those involved in that election because he was the Dean of the College of Cardinals. He was effectively a kingmaker himself. He addressed them a lot during that time.
He was prefect to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith for 20 years, or more than 20 years, but Pope for only 8 years. And Catherine, just asking you first about this, in your explainer for us on the website, you've listed it was one controversy after another, it seems, during his papacy. Over 8 years, he managed to upset Muslims, you explain. He upset those involved in ecumenical relations by talking about the special place of Catholicism. He reinstated a Holocaust denier. He started child abuse actions against various people, but he just admonished the Irish bishops who didn't take action. Anyway, all over the place, controversy and criticism for 8 years. Just unpack that for us a little bit. Start with 2006, I've got, was the first date that you mentioned here, when the Regensburg address where he upset Muslims.
Yes, this is one of his very early visits as a pope outside Italy, and he went home to Germany to speak there. And he gave this speech at Regensburg at the university where he'd once been a professor, and it was a very learned speech. But in the middle of it, he quoted a Byzantine emperor who suggested that, I'm really paraphrasing now, suggested that Islam was strongly connected to violence, and it was a quote that might have worked if he'd been writing an academic paper. It would have been heavily footnoted, I'm sure, but this was a pope speaking, and this comment that he made about Islam was picked up in the Arab world, and within a couple of days or so, and there was absolute uproar. And I think it was an indication that he hadn't quite left academia behind. He hadn't quite realized that being pope was very different from any role he'd had before, and that his words would have impact in a very different way. And there were attempts then to ameliorate the situation. He had gatherings with Muslim scholars, etc. But it caused immense damage. And then that same year, in 2006, he lifted restrictions on an old Latin rite of the Catholic Mass called the Tridentine Rite, which previous popes, including John Paul II, had restricted being used for various reasons about what that kind of liturgy said about what sort of church we are and what kind of faith we have. But one of the most neuralgic problems with it was that in this old rite, it had prayers for the Jews, which were not what you would expect to hear in the early years of the 21st century. And he attempted to alter them, but he left in, for the Good Friday prayers, for that rite, prayers for the conversion of the Jews, which did not go down well at all. So that was another problem. And then in 2009, he allowed back into the Catholic Church some rebels who were arch conservatives, who were followers of a man called Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, known then as Lefebvre's after him. And four, I think they were all bishops, were allowed back into the official Catholic Church. And around the time that he brought them back in, one of them was exposed on Swedish television as a Holocaust denier. So again, hugely problematic decision by him.
That in 2012, he initiated an investigation into US Catholic religious sisters and nuns. And that really is regarded as one of the more significant blunders of his papacy, because these are hugely popular, dedicated religious workers on the front line of Catholic care, provision of education, healthcare, social welfare provision. They're the glue that holds much of the Catholic community together in the United States. And Pope Francis, very early on when he became Pope, he ended that investigation. But, one wonders why, with all that was on his plate, with all the challenges, why did Pope Benedict do that? And I think it's symptomatic of a problem that was present throughout his time as head of the CDF and as Pope, that the mind of the church has been inordinately controlled by the far right in the United States. First of all, in its vendetta against liberation theology in the time of Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. And we know that as head of the CDF, Joseph Ratzinger came down very heavily on Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, the leading liberation theologians. And I think the sort of spectre of feminism and what he called gender ideology run wild and destroying the church was sort of fed into him. And, you know, I think with Pope Francis's Argentinian background, it's all, the tables have turned. You know, he clearly is no sympathizer of the American right, but I think the damage was done. And I think the investigation into the American sisters was a symptom of a much wider problem about the influence of the far right. Now, that influence wasn't total with regard to war and military escapades, with regard to poverty and social and economic justice. Definitely neither John Paul II nor Benedict ever fell into line with the right. But with regard to sexual ethics, which became the driving motor of Benedict's papacy, it was all driven by this kind of very conservative agenda.
I think to a certain extent, yes. I think if we want to look at the kind of disasters that there were, the problems that took place, I still go back to the point. I think it rested on this inability to size people up and appoint the right people. Why did he lift the excommunication of Williamson? Well, you know, he didn't know about Williamson. That was something that he should have had someone to advise on. And similarly, the investigation into the nuns was driven, I think, by the US bishops who had their own agenda. And there was this sense, I think, when he was Pope, when these mistakes happened, he just didn't seem to be in control, didn't seem to be exercising the papal office with freedom, as you might say. Allowed a court to develop, allowed the sort of the gatekeepers such as Archbishop Gansfine, his personal secretary, to have far too much power and influence. People around him were controlling things. What's different with Francis is you don't actually have anyone speaking, in a sense, as the gatekeeper for Francis, as the interpreter for Francis. Francis speaks directly and doesn't have a kind of coterie around him who are controlling everything. I mean, under Benedict, people knew exactly when there would be a consistory to create new cardinals. They knew appointments 2 days in advance. There were constant leaks. There was the leaking of his personal kind of correspondence by his butler, apparently, to the media. I mean, it was out of control. And I think it comes down to basically the problem he had in governance. He was not naturally someone who could lead and govern when it came to, as I say, appointments and the structural reforms that were needed. Now, I think he did take important steps on sexual abuse. I think he was the first person in the Vatican, particularly in the 80s and 90s and later, to take the crisis seriously. He demanded that cases be sent to the CDF. He took action against Maciel, one of the worst abusers in the church. He was extremely powerful. He was the first pope to meet with abuse victims. So he took important steps on that. And I think one thing we haven't talked about as Pope, which I think is an important part of his legacy, are the encyclicals that he wrote on faith, hope, and love. His focus on environmentalism. He was known as the first Green Pope. He took that very seriously. And I think if you read Ratzinger or read Benedict, you can see the direction he wanted his pontificate to go in. There was almost like what the Pope wrote and taught and what he did. There were kind of sometimes two different things going on there.
Do you think he recognised that he actually couldn't achieve what he wanted to, and that was a motivating factor for him to resign?
I think it must have been. We've never been given a convincing explanation of why he decided to resign, but I think at least part of it was that he had lost control of the Vatican. And I don't think he was expecting the publicity and the public focus on him. When he was Cardinal of the CDF, he ran a very small team. He could decide when to give interviews. He was kind of largely out of the public eye in terms of the global media. He was very well known in the Catholic world, and his audience was always the specialists to a certain extent, academics, or those who were very, very much involved in the church. It was I would say the audience in the pews rather than the audience outside of the pews, which was more Francis. But when he became Pope, there was massive media scrutiny. And Catherine mentioned the Regensburg address. It may well have been a good address in the academy, but in the full glare of the media spotlight, it wasn't.
In many of the tributes that have been paid to him in the last few days, it has been said that he will be known in history as the Pope who resigned. Do you think that that is the key thing that people remember about him?
Well, I think it's bound to be after all these years. One of the things about the Regensburg address, which was such a crisis in the fairly early papacy, it struck me at the time that he hadn't asked advice. And when Chris Lamb says that he had these people around him and out of control, I sort of get the impression he's a man who was so convinced of his own abilities, his own knowledge, that he doesn't feel it is. I remember that Michael Fitzgerald, whom some of you will know, who is now a cardinal in retirement, I might add, on a parish in Liverpool, very admirably. Michael Fitzgerald told me once that he couldn't understand why, if he was going to make, Fitzgerald actually was an expert on Islam. He'd worked in the Middle East all his life, pretty much all his priestly life. Couldn't understand why, if the Pope was going to make going to talk about Islam, why he hadn't consulted him. And we talk about the Pope's encyclicals. One of the other things that's been mentioned is Faith and Reason, of course, is one of his most important encyclicals. But the first encyclical always struck me as having really been written by his predecessor. And that was the one that, in my mind, has made most impact. I mean, he took it over from him. But I think that people say that, to go back to the question you asked me about the resignation, people say he's the first Pope to resign after 600 years. In fact, it's slightly more than that in some respects, because the Pope that resigned in the 15th century, in 1415 and 1417, respectively, were actually forced out of office. Ratzinger wasn't forced out of office. Pope Benedict XVI wasn't forced out of office. So the correct analogy is with Clement the Fifth in 1294, who did resign for the same sort of reasons. You rather get the impression that Cardinal Ratzinger has resigned. Sorry, Benedict the 16th has resigned.
You edited a dictionary of the popes. How does Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, rank in terms of the great popes in history? Top 10?
Well, he's the last one in my book. I was where he ranked. He's the last one. No, I mean, he's obviously a very significant character. There's no question at all about that. I mean, he was a theologian. We don't often have theologians on the chair of St. Peter. That's a good thing, actually. But leave theology to the theologians rather than to the pontiffs. But he was obviously a theologian, and that marked him out as one of the more significant popes of certainly since the Renaissance.
Thank you. Just looking forward then a bit now, Christopher, can I ask you to just assess the significance of Benedict's resignation as to how it may affect the future of the papacy? You wrote in your tablet that it was significant for reshaping the idea of the papacy, and that there are suggestions that Pope Francis, who's in ill health himself, may make that move. What is the significance of his decision to resign for the future?
Well, I think it's reformed the papacy. To a certain extent, it's demystified it. It's moved it away from a monarchical model to a servant leader model. That's something that Francis has taken up. I think it's interesting to see the response to Benedict's death in Rome so far. See, there are big crowds going to visit him lying in state, pay their respects. We had about 65,000 yesterday, but it's nowhere near the numbers of John Paul II. John Paul II's funeral was the biggest in human history. largest in human history. It was, there were about, I think, around 4 million people in Rome. So it's very different in terms of the numbers and the outpouring of grief that there was for John Paul II. And that is partly because of the resignation. I think the real emotion that was expressed for Benedict came out when he resigned and when he left in that helicopter in an incredibly choreographed way. It was described as Fellini in reverse, I seem to remember at the time. That was the kind of moment that people said goodbye. And this has been strangely, I think, not strangely, but this has been more low-key. And that's part of the resignation situation. So we've had this unprecedented situation of a retired pope dying, not a serving pope dying, and the fact that the current Pope, Francis, will celebrate the funeral, which is, I think, unheard of in well, so I don't know, Michael will be able to say if it's ever happened before. Some people say it's never happened before. So
it never happened before. None
it's
of
never
the
happened.
that resigned had that.
So it's never happened. It's never happened. Can we quote you
One
on
of the things that I think about Benedict, which upset me, I mean, he stayed in the Vatican. He kept dressing in white. He was the Pope Emeritus. That wasn't the pattern. I mean, when Clement V resigned, he went off and became a monk again, or tried to, but his successor stuck him in a prison. But, and the ones that resigned in the early 15th century, one of them was created a cardinal again and retired to Florence. One of them sent off to Peninsula, and the other one sort of just disappeared. But I think there is one important point about the funeral. We've in a sense, it's something that's been touched upon already, is that although not many people will be there, there won't be the great crowds that there were for JP2, at least the cardinals will be there. And I can't imagine that the conversation won't turn on a successor to Francis.
You think the cardinals will be there, you're saying? You think?
I would have thought the cardinals would turn up, yes.
I don't think that many
I'd be shocked if they didn't.
cardinals will be there. I think there'll be some. I think there'll be mainly Rome-based cardinals and those who can get there in a short space of time. I don't think there'll be a full turn. I don't think they haven't been ordered to come.
Can I bring in Catherine at this point? And for any journalists who are watching this before the funeral on Thursday this week, Catherine, could you just talk us through, we've talked about the presence of the people and how many will be there, but what is likely to happen? How should a journalist report it?
Well, I think Chris will probably know the most of all of us about the current situation, but what we've been told so far is that it's going to be a solemn but simple funeral. Now, the Vatican does solemn very well. I'll be interested to see what their idea of simple is. And I like Michael, I'd be surprised if there weren't many cardinals there. I mean, Chris, you just said that it'll be people who can get there easily. Well, in the age of the plane, it's pretty easy, even if it's a long flight. I would have thought there'd be a fair few, and I think they'll enjoy being there in order to talk about what happens next. There are certain things already that haven't happened that would normally happen when a pope dies. So the bells of St. Peter's didn't toll when Benedict died, and they would normally when a pope dies. They didn't have to break the fisherman's ring that a pope wears because they'd already defaced Benedict's ring when he stepped down. I think I'm right in saying that with his body lying in state, there isn't a pallium, particular article of clothing that popes wear on the body, again signifying that he wasn't the reigning pope, but he will be buried, as I understand it, in the usual 3 coffins that they bury popes in, and one of the reasons why they're buried in so many coffins is to preserve the body in case they need to dig him up for investigations regarding any possibility of him being beatified and canonized. I noted somebody yesterday wrote a letter to the Times saying that he should be made a saint quickly because this was the tradition. which flabbergasted me. Michael know better than me. I don't think it's a tradition to quickly canonize popes. It was Benedict who introduced this by quickly canonizing his predecessor. So there's a certain amount we know. There's a lot yet to emerge at this funeral, but I would be surprised if it's remotely simple.
The final question to you, Michael: when will Pope Benedict be made a saint?
Well, it's about time we stopped canonizing popes, I think. In fact, I think it's about time we stopped canonizing most people. There are far too many saints around.
So it's not automatic then, you don't think?
It is absolutely not automatic, no. I mean, until there are some absolutely admirable popes who aren't saints, like Pope Leo XIII and the great, the writer of Revera Novana, the most important encyclical, I think, that the Church has had in many a long day.
Can I just add that I think the rapid canonization has been a disaster, because the more we learn about Pope John Paul II's failure to tackle the sex abuse scandal, the less of a suitable candidate for sainthood he seems to become. And that's why, if they are going to canonize each other, and God forbid, I just don't think they should. I think being Pope should disqualify you from sainthood, because you have to get too involved with the grubby workings of the world if you're going to be a successful Pope. But one way or the other, you know, if they're going to do it, they need a long history for everything to come out in the wash. And with John Paul II, I think the idea of sainthood has been debased by its too rapid conferral on a man whose papacy is increasingly looking like a disgrace.
Yeah.
Well, that is interesting, Tina, because the obits that are being written about Pope Benedict are, balanced. He's a gentleman, but at the same time, the flaws in his papacy and his conservative tendencies in the Vatican are there for all to see. That's a strange thing about having a pope who resigns. The obituaries are different, I suppose. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part in this discussion. Just to say that next week's Zoom media briefing on Tuesday is a look ahead to 2023, which we're going to try to make as optimistic as possible after the review of 2022 descended into rather pessimistic gloom. So thank you very much for joining us for this first media briefing of 2023, and we look forward to your company later in the year.